And I mean, right now you're living aside from, and you wouldn't want, just to be clear, you wouldn't want the same regulatory authority that you have for, say, generic drugs. This is still a different realm, this compounding?
Well, compounding pharmacies historically have been under the day-to-day regulatory oversight of states. And, you know, compounding pharmacists exist in many local pharmacies and provide a very important service to the healthcare system in terms of making products for special patient needs. If you need a pediatric formulation or you're allergic to a component of the FDA-approved drug, the compounding pharmacist can make the drug you need. What's happened over time is that compounders have grown bigger. They've sort of merged into these hybrid compounder manufacturers, but we're seeing an industry that is adapting in some ways to reflect how the healthcare system is changing as well. Hospital pharmacies used to serve the needs of their hospital system, and the hospital pharmacist would put the potassium chloride in the intravenous bag or repackage from a larger product, individually filled syringes for use on the hospital ward. But for reasons of both efficiency and in some instances, I do think improved quality, hospitals started outsourcing some of these functions to other pharmacies. And those pharmacies sort of are fitting into a gray area that I think we now need to address. And one of the things that I'm hoping as we talk with Congress about legislation that's needed is to really look at how we can make sure that important medical care needs are addressed, but in a way that has responsible oversight, where there are, in fact, clear federal standards for practice that can be enforced, where right now compounding pharmacies don't register with the FDA. We don't know who they are, what they're doing. There's no requirement for adverse event reporting. There's no requirement for labeling what kind of pharmacy the products are coming from. Some of the physicians that gave their patients the steroid injections involved in the current meningitis outbreak said later that they had no idea they weren't using an FDA-approved product. And importantly, one of the gaps in the authorities that FDA has struggled with, even when we go into compounding pharmacies to try to address an acute public health problem, is that because the authorities are vague and because there are limits, we can't even get access always to all that we need to do a full and adequate inspection, including access to records.
Now I want to open this up to audience questions in just a bit, so if we could, people raise your hands and the mics will come out. But so are we ready for a world that is largely generic? I mean, it's not just the compounding, we've got this whole, suddenly we're in a world where 80% or more of the drugs people are being prescribed are made by generic companies. It was a lot easier to regulate, I'd imagine, when there were just, a few dozen branded ones.
Well, I think, the fundamental question that I think you're getting at is how can we, whoever is making the product, compounding pharmacist, generic manufacturer, or innovator manufacturer, how can we really support high quality products? And the generic world is obviously very, very important to our healthcare system. The large majority of prescriptions filled today are generic drugs. And we want to make sure that patients can have access to drugs that they need, and cost is an issue. But I think one of the problems that we've been faced with at the FDA is that as the generic industry has expanded, and a lot of it is global, we haven't had the resources to provide some of the routine inspections and the more rapid review also of applications that is really essential. And one of the great accomplishments of last spring was the passage of our new FDASIA legislation, what is it?
We don't have to spell it out. The point is, you got user fees for generic drugs.
The FDA Safety and Innovation Act, which for the first time gives the agency dollars from the generic drug industry to actually support generic drug review, including inspections. And this will be just enormously transformational in terms of our ability to engage with the generic industry to achieve the goal of high quality products. And I think that what we want is a world where no matter who's making the product, quality, safety, and efficacy are built into those products. There's a system for ongoing monitoring, and patients can benefit from the opportunities in science and technology today.
Ovik?
Hi, Ovik Roy from Forbes and the Manhattan Institute. I'm curious to know that whether you think that the FDA, in terms of its current structure, the org chart, the review process, whether you think it's fine as is, or whether you think there are things that the FDA could do in terms of whether it's the organization, the way, the hierarchy and command structure, the way the FDA reviews drugs, and or the review process, or other things structurally that the FDA could change or do better?
Well, I think the FDA clearly has to be a dynamic organization, changing over time as the issues before us change and the world in which we work changes. And actually one of the challenges of my tenure has been really trying to reposition the FDA for the 21st century, and in some critical areas, one being strengthening the science base of the organization, which is obviously critical to everything that we do, and that involves both strengthening and improving our expertise within the walls of FDA, but also some of the engagements with industry and academia and others around science that ensures both the research we need gets done and we have access to the experts that we need to do our job as well as we possibly can. The other I just mentioned briefly in relation to generics is globalization, which has dramatically changed what we do. When FDA first started and when the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was put into place back in the late 1930s, it was a very different world, and most of the products we regulated were in fact being made here. Now, on the drug side, 80% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients in drugs we take here come from other countries. 40% of finished drugs come from other countries. Supply chains are much more complex. And so, we have to do things differently, both in terms of we now have offices around the world. We have to send teams to places in remote parts of the world. And we have to work with both regulators and industry in a much more global way. So that's led to some significant changes within our agency organization, and also in how we work externally. I have done some reorganization since I've been at the FDA, and there, I can see areas where I want to continue to work. But one area, for example, was to create a deputy commissioner for medical products, because we have the Center for Devices, the Center for Biologics, the Center for Drugs. But increasingly, we're seeing that products cut across those center lines, and we need to ensure cross-coordination and integration of programs, although there are very distinct legal regulatory frameworks that differentiate those products as well, and that contributes to our challenges too.
Does that one person work enough as a horizontal connector between those? I mean, is that enough?
Well,
that's talking a lot about horizontal connections.
Well, it's a step, and we're still early on in building this new organization, but we also are creating other mechanisms for the coordination, and we're making progress. I mean, we are actually approving, some of our recent approvals reflect it, devices linked to therapeutics. It has required that kind of coordinated effort, but it's getting more and more confusing, and I think we're going to have to address it organizationally, scientifically, and legislatively, because products don't fit into the old frameworks